Hello, welcome Slashers, Knife here, and welcome to Shelved Horror, where we talk about all the horror ideas that never saw the light of day. Today, we will be talking about Resident Evil 3.5.
The cradle of the progenitor virus. Leon S. Kennedy. Possessed.
I'm making this video in celebration for the new upcoming Resident Evil 4 remake that is on the horizon. You guys will probably be seeing this by the time it comes out. I am a big fan of the original Resident Evil 4 and I cannot wait for the Resident Evil 4 remake, especially after getting the Dead Space remake, which was also a very goated remake. But before I fully delve into this, I must first answer, what was Resident Evil 3.5? Resident Evil 3.5 is a term used to describe the many different prototypes in different builds of Resident Evil 4. So basically different prototype stages. Announced in 2001, Resident Evil 4 went through quite the development period. Resident Evil 4 began development in 2000 and officially released in 2005. Within that span of time, Resident Evil 4 went under 4 different versions, and that includes what would end up becoming the final game. Let's go over these 4 versions of Resident Evil 4, or Resident Evil 3.5. First, starting off with the 2000 version. This version of Resident Evil 4 being worked on in 2000 would follow the story uncovering the mystery of Tony Redgrave, who would be the protagonist of this game, as well as also following his twin brother Paul Redgrave. These would be the sons of Oswald E. Spencer. Tony Redgrave would have superpowers from being infected with the G virus. This version of Resident Evil 4 would ultimately get scrapped, and would instead get recycled for use in the popular hack-and-slash game Devil May Cry, turning Tony Redgrave and Paul Redgrave into Dante and Virgil. Instead of these superpowers being because of the G virus, these would be demonic powers that the characters would wield. Pretty fascinating stuff. Now let's talk about the castle version of Resident Evil 4. Announced at TGS 2002's Spring Expo, the castle version of Resident Evil 4, which existed from 2001 to 2002, work began by Production Studio 4, after executive producer Shinji Mikami convinced Team Little Devil, the devs of the previous version, the 2000 version, to retitle their Resident Evil 4 prototype, which again turned into Devil May Cry. This is overall due to the 2000 version being too different compared to the rest of the series. But we're talking about the castle version. The other names of the castle version of Resident Evil 4 include Fog missed an airship. The castle version involves Leon S. Kennedy, who was brought into the US military after the events of Resident Evil 2, now a soldier with the elite anti-Umbrella pursuit and investigation team, part of US Stratcom. He participates in a raid on the castle of Oswald E. Spencer, where Umbrella HQ is located. The mission goes wrong when the squad encounters the Black Fog BOW. More on this enemy later. Leon is infected with the retrovirus and must fight back against his body's mutations. During his exploration of the castle, Leon runs into a girl who was subject to some of Umbrella's experiments, and is also protected by a BOW dog companion, which the dog would also help with exploration. Leon's investigation would also uncover the remains of an ancient underground civilization just below the castle, where the progenitor virus was isolated within the body of its superhuman king, revealing that Umbrella Pharmaceuticals' existence was overall a tool for Lord Spencer to achieve immortality. Oswald Spencer would be the main antagonist, the main villain of this version of Resident Evil 4, and would also include Wesker attacking the castle with this new virus, which would result in Leon almost dying and would be the reason why he would have this virus that he would be fighting within his body to prevent from taking over fully. Throughout this, Leon would also learn the true origins of the T-virus. Part of the game would also take place on an airship, which, was also the reason why one of the nicknames was Airship. But that would have been really cool to navigate a level that would take place on an airship. The castle version of Resident Evil 4 would also use 3D settings rather than the pre-rendered backgrounds that were in the older games. So yes, fixed camera angles would have returned for this version. As work progressed with the castle version, the programming team would however run into some issues. The Black Fog enemy, which was intended to be something of a highlight of this version of Resident Evil 4, was a very ambitious creation on their part. A floating mass of black tentacles. It proved too taxing for the GameCube's hardware, as it had trouble rendering it. This design would somewhat be recycled and reused for Resident Evil 5's enemy, the Ouroboros, which also has tentacles all over his body, but doesn't have like a massive mass of smoke. To resolve this game went through somewhat a big change after TGS 2002. Kawamura devised an alternative arrangement of enemies, which would be hallucinations, the side effect of Leon's mutations. Though this would require a revised and rewritten story and overall changes to the mechanics, Shibata and Kawamura began work on the next phase of the game's development. This version would be called Hallucination. The castle script written by Sugimura, however, was sent over to Production Studio 1, which would get turned into the underrated survival horror game Haunting Ground, which I do eventually plan to cover in the near future. Basically, for Haunting Ground, they got rid of Leon, they kept the girl and the dog, and they messed around with some of the other mechanics and story elements, and it's pretty much a Clock Tower successor, if you know what Clock Tower is. Another survival horror game that I want to cover on the channel in the future. But anyway, let's talk about the Hallucination version of Resident Evil 4. Hallucination is a nickname given to the 2003 build of Resident Evil 4. This version is also known as Hookman and also Ghostbot, which was a nickname that Kawamura came up with. Kashu Heiza also states, Hookman was merely an experiment and there was no true backstory. I wanted to make Biohazard 4, aka Resident Evil 4, scarier and suggested using a particular scene from the film The Lost Souls, where the main character, played by Winona Ryder, while washing her hands in a bathroom, suddenly finds herself in a derelict building with a killer on the loose. An arranged version of this idea eventually turned into a Hookman. The idea of the Hookman would have been a pretty neat idea to see past the gameplay footage of this version. The gameplay footage for this version that I'm going to be showcasing and talking about is actually from the Biohazard 4 secret DVD. To add more context to the Hallucinations version of Resident Evil 4, another dev, Hiroyuki Kobayashi, goes on to state, the second concept was that Leon was hit with a bizarre disease in which he started to see illusions and monsters that weren't really there. He would attack and strike out at them, but he couldn't do them any harm. And past this, it overall seemed like they're going to carry over a lot of the mechanics and story elements from the Castle version. In this version, basically the enemies that Leon would face would basically be hallucinations and a part of his imagination. So the monsters would only exist in the depth of Leon's mind, which is a pretty cool concept. I will say this version of Resident Evil 4 looks fucking awesome. It all overall plays out ominously. From the way the environments look, along with Leon's cautious movements, I really loved the level design in this version. Instead of the Las Plagas resigning in knight armor, you know, those enemies that they would actually have the parasite inside of them and they could move around and they could like strike you with axes and shit. Yeah, instead of those Las Plagas armor enemies, the knight armor in this version would be completely paranormal. It's overall really creepy. And not to mention the camera angles and how everything pans to certain rooms. The whole vibe of the Hallucination version is a lot like Silent Hill. And I overall really need to bring this up if I'm going to talk about this version. The killer dolls. The dolls are so fucking creepy in this. This is definitely something that I found really fucking fascinating when I found out about this version. And though creepy dolls are kind of dreaded in the horror space, we surprisingly don't really see many games that actually have killer dolls as enemies. Honestly, I want to see more games that utilize killer dolls as an actual enemy type, because that would be creepy, and just imagine them running at you. It'd be stressful, especially if they do a lot of damage. Again, the killer dolls in this were, quite honestly, very terrifying. It's clear where Resident Evil Village got their idea for that creepy doll Angie, which I wish they did more with in Resident Evil Village. I liked Angie. I thought that Angie was creepy and quite an interesting character, and I was really excited to see Angie included in this game, but they didn't really utilize her to the best of her ability, in my opinion. Yeah, I thought the baby part where like the giant mutated baby chases you is creepy and all, but how awesome would have it been if you had to like sneak around the Angie doll and she'd like be pursuing you and trying to kill you the whole way? It would have been creepy to see her actually running after you. But no, they didn't do it for some reason. I just feel like it's a bit of a letdown if they're going to have a killer doll in the game, or a haunted doll, whatever you want to call it. Though Angie's inclusion in Resident Evil Village was awesome, but a bit of a letdown with me expecting more from Angie, I do still want to get an Angie doll in the future. If you look on Etsy, there are actually some options for an Angie doll. You could buy yourself your very own Angie doll. The most expensive one's like $3,000, and she has like those little puppeteer things where you can like move her around and stuff. Then there's the $500 one. I do want to get one of these in the future because Angie's a pretty dope character. I'll leave a link to buy these if you guys want one for yourself. But anyway, to get back on track of talking about the Hallucination version of Resident Evil 4, something that I found interesting is that incendiary grenades were the most effective against the haunted dolls, or the hallucination dolls, whatever you want to call them. But to even go further into the gameplay, minus the great and inspired level design that this version features, which I can't help but love, the Hookman ends up showing up later on in this footage. The Hookman, again, is a really badass concept for an enemy type. It's really a shame that they had to get rid of him, because in my opinion, I thought he was pretty cool. I should also note that a fan did make a fan game demo of this version of Resident Evil, and it's titled Resident Evil Code Madman. This fan-made demo is basically made to give Resident Evil fans a taste of what we missed not being able to play this version of Resident Evil 4. I've seen a little bit of gameplay of this version, and it's pretty interesting. Maybe someone in the future will go ahead and not make a fan game of this version of Resident Evil, but make a game directly inspired by it. That would be really cool, because then they can sell it and they can make money, and I think it would be a really cool idea to see someone bring an idea like this to life, but make it original instead of just making it like a Resident Evil fan game. Not that there's anything wrong with Resident Evil fan games, but anyway, by fall of 2003, Shibata ended the Hallucination build of Resident Evil 4, and instead began working on the next build of Resident Evil 4, which would end up becoming the final version of Resident Evil 4. This version would be referred to as the zombie version. It would be late 2003 when development would end on the Hallucination version of Resident Evil 4, and where development on the next version would start. This would be the next development cycle after the Hallucination version of Resident Evil 4. This version was seen by the staff members as a return to the standard formula, which producer Shinji Mikami was very critical of and just felt that it was getting repetitive overall, as it was too much of the same like the previous games before it. For this version, the hallucination mechanics would be gone, and the story had a lot of the same elements as the castle version, and there would be a new human type of enemy called the Dabaman, which would be controlled by parasite organisms. You see where this is going, right? Just like the final game. Not long after the project started production, producer Shinji Mikami dismissed Shibata and then proceeded to take over as director for this game. The Dabamen were then recycled and turned into the Ganados, which apparently is also Spanish for livestock. Oh, and apparently originally Sherry Birkin was supposed to be the girl he saved before they changed it to Ashley. There would be some unused enemies as well, as shown here. This would include versions of enemies we got in the final game, like the Armored Ganado, which was a prototype version of the Garrador enemy. Then we'd get enemies rejected from the game entirely, like the Super Dynamite Man, who is rigged with dynamites on his chest and head and carries a torch, serving as a suicide bomber. Then there's another cut enemy referred only as the Parasite Woman, who also shares similarities to another enemy from the Code Veronica game that went by Nosferatu. She has other rejected concepts that also weren't used, some of which were used for the Juavo enemy type in Resident Evil 6. Electric Man was another rejected enemy type, though not much of anything is really known about him. And then the last cut enemy that I will be mentioning, the Lurching Man, was a prototype version of the Regenerator enemy. But a difference about the Lurching Man was that he had the ability to turn into a blob or into liquid, alternative to his main form. As you can see, guys, a little bit of each version was carried over to the final product. And yes, with that came some ideas getting left on the cutting room floor where seen fit. With these hard decisions being made for Resident Evil 4, it overall shaped into the final product. And that brings me to yet again explain why these versions were scrapped in the first place. Obviously, for the 2000 build of Resident Evil 4, the game just drifted too far from what makes Resident Evil. So the people working on that version made the good decision of turning that version into Devil May Cry. For the castle version of Resident Evil 4, one of the most important enemies of that version was the Black Fog enemy, the floating mass of tentacles that was to infect Leon. Capcom was unable to develop realistic and resource-light animations, forcing Shibata to oversee changes in how this game would appear. The only footage of Castle available is the TGS 2002 trailer. With this version being cancelled, it prompted the departure of Yasuhisa Kawamura and Noboru Sugimura as writers. The completed Castle script was later handed over to Studio 2 for, like I mentioned earlier, Haunting Ground, which again kept its focus on the girl and the dog, as well as kept the relationship with her and the villain, but overall removing Leon from the story. For the Hallucination version, it was based around a complicated mechanic, at least complicated for back then at least, where two versions of a room would load each time, one in the real world and one in the hallucination world, which would contain the enemies. By choosing this mechanic, the player would instantly cross between worlds when crossing a checkpoint without having an additional loading sequence. This again would prove to be the game's undoing, as the GameCube was not powerful enough to load up all these assets at once, with the experiment being deemed a failure, Kawamura left the team, and this version had to get cut. The zombie version was quickly halted by producer Shinji Mikami. This was following concerns by the company that the game's sales would stagnate if the game was too formulaic, which in turn would make the franchise too repetitive, which is why the Ganados were used as the primary enemies instead of zombies. And overall, why we got the Resident Evil 4 we all know and love. Did these versions deserve to get shelved? In hindsight, I completely understand why these versions had to get cancelled. A lot of it is related to limited hardware back then, which again is understandable. These hardware issues were mainly issues found within the Castle and Hallucination versions. Some of it was related to the possible tonal shift of the franchise. That would be related to the 2000 version as well as the Hallucination version. And then for the zombie version, I mean, they were just kind of sick of doing zombies. So the franchise was ready for something new, and I think that was a wise decision to make. It must have been hard, yes, but I think it was right for the franchise. What do we get in return for all this trial and error? A masterpiece of a game that even today still gets a ton of high praise and love. This is a game that Resident Evil fans and just survival horror fans in general just love the fuck out of. And I overall hope that they do this amazing game justice with the Resident Evil 4 remake, which I've been hearing a ton of early reviews about it, and the people that got to play it early are apparently really loving it, so I really cannot wait. And I mean, they also added Leon into Fortnite, which I had to buy him. I bought him, guys. it's Leon in Fortnite and Claire. Overall, the only version that I wish we could have saw in some way, shape, or form was the Hallucination version, which I guess we got a little bit of a taste of that in Resident Evil Village with that whole segment with the doll and the mutated baby and shit. But basically just a game, whether it be in the Resident Evil franchise or a completely original game that was made in the vision of the Hallucination version, completely. Had all the same enemies and everything. This version had a lot of interesting mechanics, and also the Hookman, you know, the killer dolls. That version just stands out the most. But overall, we still got a little bit of each of these versions within other IPs. Devil May Cry, Haunting Ground, and yes, of course, Resident Evil 4. But that'll be all for today's video, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did, be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content, and definitely subscribe to become a slasher. All social media links in my merch description below. Thank you guys so much for watching my video on Resident Evil 3.5. This video was originally supposed to be out for the release of Resident Evil Village, but I took too long to make it, so ended up not happening. But I'm just happy to still cover this game overall, as it's been a fascinating canceled project for me for quite some time. I've always had some sort of interest in Resident Evil 3.5, and now I finally get to fully explore it. And I mean, looking into this, I learned a lot about Resident Evil 3.5, and I'm just happy to make this video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope it does well, because I want to do more content like this in the future. So if you want to see more stuff like this, subscribe for more. But I'm out of here, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget, guys, to keep on slashing.